This is a story about the greatest treasure in American history, and it ruins two sets of lives, a century apart, in almost exactly the same way. In September 1857, a steamship carrying 15 tons of California gold sailed into a hurricane off the Carolinas and took 425 people and a national economy down with her. For 130 years, she was a legend, the ship of gold, lying a mile and a half deep, beyond the reach of any human being alive. Then, in the 1980s, a quiet engineer from Ohio did something nobody thought possible. He found her. Not with luck, with mathematics. He raised millions from ordinary investors, built a robot no one had ever built, brought up gold no one had ever touched, and became the most celebrated treasure hunter on Earth. And then the money vanished. The investors got nothing. The genius went on the run. Cash, burner phones, a hotel room, under a false name. And when the marshals finally kicked in the door, he made a choice that still stands as one of the strangest in the history of money. He spent nearly 10 years in a jail cell rather than answer one single question. Where are the coins? He got out in 2025. He never answered. Stay with me, because every part of this story is true, and the ending is not the one anybody deserved. To understand why 15 tons of gold was on one wooden ship, you have to understand how money physically moved in 1857. California, 9 years after the gold rush began, was pouring out wealth, but California was 3,000 overland miles from the banks of New York, with no railroad connecting them and no way to wire value across a continent. Gold had to travel as cargo, and the route it traveled was one of the great conveyor belts of the age. Steamship from San Francisco down to Panama, a short new railroad across the jungle of the Isthmus, and then a second steamship from Panama up the Atlantic coast to New York. Twice a month, ships on this route carried the literal lifeblood of the American financial system. The banks of New York issued paper and credit against gold they expected to arrive. The gold arrived, backed the paper, and the wheel turned. It worked beautifully, as long as the ships did. The SS Central America was one of the workhorses of that Atlantic leg. A 280-foot sidewheel steamer that had carried, across her career, a meaningful fraction of all the gold rush treasure that ever reached the East Coast. In September 1857, she left Panama on a routine run north. On board, roughly 578 men, women, and children, including miners going home rich, their life savings in belts and carpet bags, and, in her hold, a commercial shipment of about 15 tons of California gold. Coins, freshly struck. Ingots, still bright. She was, quite literally, the economy in transit. Her captain was William Lewis Herndon, and he matters to this story, so give him a moment. Herndon was not a treasure man. He was a working officer of the United States Navy, on loan to the Mail Steamship Service, and already mildly famous for something else entirely. A few years earlier, he had led the first American expedition down the length of the Amazon and written a report so vivid that a young riverboat pilot named Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, would credit it with stirring his imagination. Herndon was, by every account that survives, exactly what you would want a captain to be: precise, calm, and privately convinced that a captain's life belongs to his passengers. The passengers themselves were the gold rush going home. Newlyweds, families, miners who had spent 5 years in the diggings and were carrying everything those years had earned. Some with thousands of dollars in gold sewn into their coats, some with nuggets in trunks, one reportedly with a fortune in dust strapped around his waist that he would later have to decide whether to remove as the water rose. 578 people, 15 tons of official gold, and an uncounted second treasure in belts and pockets. all of it steaming north into the second week of September. Hurricane season. The wind began on September 9th, somewhere off Florida, and it did not stop building for 3 days. By the 10th, the Central America was in the grip of a full hurricane, a wall of wind heeling her over so hard that her side wheels ran uselessly, one buried in the sea, the other beating air. And then the leak began. Water found its way into the hull faster than the pumps could move it, and it rose toward the one thing a steamship cannot lose: the boiler fires. What followed is one of the great grim epics of the age of steam. The fires drowned. The engines stopped. And 500 men, passengers, miners, millionaires, deckhands, no distinction anymore, formed bailing lines through the flooded dark, passing buckets hand to hand, hour after hour, through the night and into the next day. Men who had survived cholera on the Isthmus and 5 winters in the goldfields spent their last strength scooping the Atlantic out of a dying ship, a bucket at a time. They kept her afloat, by muscle alone, for more than a day. It wasn't enough. On the afternoon of September 12th, with the storm easing but the ship settling, a passing brig, the Marine, saw her distress flag. There was time for exactly one mercy. The lifeboats went into the water, and nearly every woman and child aboard was rowed across the swells to safety. The men stood at the rail and watched them go. Most understood what that meant. Just after 8 in the evening, the Central America gave her final lurch. Survivors described the ship going down stern first, and a sound they never forgot. Hundreds of voices rising together as the deck fell away beneath them. Captain Herndon was last seen where the accounts of the age insisted a captain should be. On the wheelhouse, in his full-dress uniform, hat in hand, going down with his command. He was 39. The Navy would later raise a monument to him at Annapolis that midshipmen still circle today and name warships for him. He had gotten every woman and every child off his ship. 425 people died that night, scattered across a mile of storm-black ocean. Around 150 were pulled from the water by the Marine and a handful of other vessels, including, days later, a few men found still afloat on wreckage, delirious, having watched the sea take everyone around them. And the gold, the 15 official tons, the belts, the trunks, the coat seams of 5 years' labor, went down through 1.5 miles of blackness and settled on the seabed, 2,200 meters down. Deeper than any diver. Deeper than any technology of that century or the next one. The richest single point on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, and as far as 1857 was concerned, it might as well have been on the moon. The news reached New York by telegraph before the survivors did, and it landed on a financial system already sweating. That summer had been nervous. A major insurance and trust company in Ohio had collapsed in August. Railroad stocks, the tech bubble of the era, were sliding. Banks in New York had extended credit far beyond their vaults, confident as always in the arriving gold of California. The Central America's shipment was real, expected money in a system running on expectations. And then the ship of gold simply didn't arrive. 15 tons of settlement, gone. Worse than the metal was the message. The artery itself could fail. Depositors formed lines. Banks called loans. Within weeks, the contagion had run through New York, through the country, and across the Atlantic. Bank suspensions, factory closures, unemployment marches, the works. The Panic of 1857 became the first financial crisis to move at the speed of the telegraph, and history remembers the sinking of the Central America as one of the shoves that pushed a teetering system over the edge. Let's be precise, because this channel doesn't inflate. The ship didn't cause the panic alone. The bubble was ready to burst. But it is a matter of record that when America's economy cracked that autumn, one of the cracks ran straight down to a wreck on the Atlantic floor. 15 tons of gold had become the most expensive absence in the country. And then the story went quiet for 130 years. Not forgotten. Legendary. The ship of gold became the Everest of lost treasure. Everyone knew roughly where she was, and no one could touch her. She lay under 2,200 meters of water, a depth that crushes submarines, a depth that human hands would not reach until the age of nuclear submarine rescues and moon landings. Generations of salvors dreamed and gave up. The technology did not exist. Then, for decades more, it existed only in the hands of navies and oil companies, at costs no treasure could justify. By the 1980s, the Central America occupied a strange category: the best documented, best located, most valuable unreachable object on the planet. Estimates of her cargo's modern value started around $100 million and climbed past $1 billion, depending on who was counting and what collectors would pay. Which is when she attracted the attention of a man who did not look like a treasure hunter at all. Tommy Thompson worked at Battelle, the giant research institute in Columbus, Ohio, a place that built technology for the Navy and industry, about as far from pirate romance as America gets. Colleagues describe a wiry, intense engineer with wild hair and index cards. Thousands of index cards. Because Thompson had a conviction, and it sounds obvious only after you hear it, the ship of gold was not a diving problem. It was an information problem. Everyone before him had asked, how do we get to the bottom of the ocean? Thompson asked a different question. How do we know where to look before we spend a single day at sea? A wreck 1.5 miles down can't be found by dragging hooks and hoping. But the ocean floor doesn't move much, and history had left clues, dozens of them, scattered in survivor testimonies, ship's logs, newspaper accounts, and Navy weather reconstructions. For years, in the evenings, Thompson and a small crew of fellow obsessives, an oceanographer, a journalist, engineers, gathered the entire documentary record of the sinking. Every reported position, every wind observation, every drift estimate from every rescue ship. Contradictory, imprecise, human, and, Thompson believed, mathematically combinable. He wasn't going to search the ocean. He was going to interrogate it. The method he used has a name: Bayesian search theory. And it's worth 60 seconds, because it's the actual hero of this act. Bayesian search works like this. You take everything you believe about where a lost thing might be, every account, every estimate, each weighted by how much you trust it, and you combine them into a probability map, a grid of the ocean, where every cell gets a number. Not X marks the spot, but this square, 2%. That square, 0.1%. Then you search in order of probability, and, this is the elegant part, every empty cell you search updates the map. Failure isn't wasted. Failure is information. The Navy had used the method to find a lost hydrogen bomb off Spain and a sunken submarine. Nobody had used it to find treasure. Thompson's team fed the historical record into the math, and out came a map. A search box of roughly 1,400 square miles, Rhode Island, with the lights off, under 1.5 miles of water, with its probabilities ranked. The plan: tow a sonar over the high cells, photograph anything promising, and only then spend real money. It was treasure hunting as an engineering discipline. Patient, unromantic, and utterly unlike 3 centuries of gold fever. All he needed now was several $1 million. Which meant the quiet engineer had to learn to do the one thing every story in this series turns on. He had to sell. Thompson pitched Columbus, Ohio, not Wall Street, his own city. Businessmen, professionals, the local establishment, eventually about 161 investors, including some of the town's most prominent families, and its newspaper money. The pitch was the map. Respected engineers vouched for the method. The wreck was historical fact. The math was sound. The technology was buildable. This wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a venture with milestones and budgets. He raised roughly $12.7 million across the effort. And it's worth pausing on who gave it, because they matter at the end of this story. This wasn't anonymous, speculative froth. It was doctors and car dealers and family money, people who shook his hand, people who would follow the expedition in their own newspaper. Columbus felt like a shareholder in the adventure. For once in this series, the money was raised honestly, for a real thing, by a man who genuinely intended to find it. Hold on to that. It makes what's coming worse. The sonar runs began in 1986. And the method worked almost embarrassingly well. Within the first season, the high-probability cells of the map yielded a short list of seabed targets. One, logged as Galaxy, looked right. The correct size, the correct size, the correct debris signature. In September 1988, Thompson's crew lowered their masterpiece over it. Nemo, a 6-ton remotely operated vehicle they had designed and built themselves in Ohio. Cameras, lights, manipulator arms, thrusters, an entire robotic archaeologist on the end of a 1.5 miles of cable, home-built because nothing rentable could do the job. Down through total darkness. 2 hours of descent. And then the lights found her, a sidewheel, standing out of the silt like a fairground ruin. The Central America, precisely where the mathematics had always said she would be. After 131 years, 3,000 feet deeper than the Titanic's discoverers had worked, found by a man who had never stopped asking better questions. And then the cameras panned down, and the crew in the control room stopped breathing. The seabed glittered. Coins, singly and in drifts. Ingots stacked where the purser's room had rotted away around them. Gold does not rust, does not tarnish, does not age in the deep. And what Nemo's lights swept across looked, in the crew's own words, like a garden of gold. Preserved to the mint luster. Waiting. Somewhere above, on the support ship, the quiet engineer from Battelle had just become the most successful treasure hunter in human history. Over the following seasons, Nemo lifted about 3 tons of it. The recovery was as careful as the search. Coins raised in silicone blocks to protect them, positions mapped like an archaeological dig. What came up rewrote the record books. Thousands of 1857 S-double eagles in condition that stunned the coin world. Seawater and silt had sealed them like a time capsule, and coins expected to be corroded came up looking like they'd left the San Francisco Mint that morning. Ingots from the Gold Rush assay offices, including a monster the crew called the Eureka Bar. Over 80 pounds of gold in a single brick, arguably the most famous single piece of treasure in America. The headlines wrote themselves, the greatest treasure in American history. Valuations ran past $100 million. A best-selling book, Ship of Gold in the Deep Blue Sea, made Thompson a folk hero. The vindicated obsessive, the engineer who beat the ocean with index cards. Museums called. Collectors circled. Columbus toasted its hometown genius, and 161 investors opened their newspapers and read about their triumph. Every fraud in this series peaks with champagne. So does every true story. The difference only shows up afterward, when the money has to go where it was promised. This is the peak. Remember the view. The first blow came not from the sea, but from lawyers, and in fairness, it was a blow Thompson half expected. 39 insurance companies, or their modern descendants, filed claims on the gold. Their argument: we insured that cargo in 1857. We paid the losses. So what comes off the seabed is ours. Thompson's side argued abandonment. For a century, the owners had made no effort and possessed no means to recover it. The sea had reclaimed it, and salvage law rewards the finder. The fight consumed the better part of a decade. It went up and down the federal courts while 3 tons of gold sat in vaults, unsold, unmonetized, appreciating in legend and legal fees simultaneously. In 1996, the courts finally settled it, roughly 92% to the Discovery Group, the remainder to the insurers. On paper, a resounding win. But something had changed in those years. The clean venture, map, robot, gold, payout, had become a decade-old tangle of partnerships, loans, deferred crew contracts, and mounting costs, all secured against a treasure that hadn't yet been converted into a single dollar of distributions. The investors had waited 10 years. The crew had waited 10 years. Everyone was still waiting on the same thing. The sale. In 2000, it finally happened. The recovered gold was sold to a California marketing group for a reported $52 million. And then came the silence. The 161 investors of Columbus, the people whose 12.7 million had built Nemo and paid for every day at sea, received nothing. Not a distribution, not an accounting, nothing. The crew members who had deferred pay for shares of the find, nothing. Where did $52 million go? That question has now outlived some of the people who first asked it. Parts of the answer emerged over the years, in fragments that never added to a whole. Enormous legal debts from the insurance war, loans repaid on unfavorable terms, money moved through a lattice of companies and partnerships, and the detail that will hang over the rest of this story, some $2.5 million reportedly placed into an offshore trust in Belize, along with 500 gold coins struck from Central America Gold, which simply left the visible record. Thompson's explanations when he gave them were those of a man describing a shipwreck of paperwork. Everything encumbered, everything owed, nothing left. Maybe. But he stopped showing up to explain. Investors sued in 2005 and 2006, among them the very newspaper family that had championed him. The court orders began, and Tommy Thompson, the man who found the unfindable, started to become hard to find. In 2012, a federal judge ordered Thompson to appear in court and account for the money, the coins, the Belize trust, all of it. He didn't come. He ran. For the next 2.5 years, the greatest treasure hunter alive lived like a man in one of his own survivor accounts, off the grid in Florida, with his longtime companion and assistant. First a rented mansion in Vero Beach paid in cash. Then, as the marshals closed in, a hotel, the Hilton Suites near Boca Raton, a nondescript business hotel where the couple paid cash, moved little, and waited. The man who had outthought the Atlantic Ocean was now applying the same discipline to the United States Marshals Service. No cards, no phones in his name, prepaid burners, cash in banded stacks. Think about the symmetry, because it's almost too neat. He had spent the 80s assembling scattered clues to find something the world said was unfindable. Now the marshals were doing the same thing. Receipts, sightings, probabilities to find him. A Bayesian search for the Bayesian searcher. It ended the way these things end. In January 2015, marshals knocked on a door at the Hilton. Inside, Thompson, his companion, roughly $425,000 in cash, a stack of prepaid phones, and, investigators noted, apparently without irony, a book on how to live off the grid. The chase was over. The question was not. Because here is where this story leaves every other one we've told. Thompson pleaded guilty for the flight. That part was simple. A fine, an agreement to cooperate. Then the court asked him the only question anyone actually cared about. Where are the 500 coins? His answer, in essence, there is a trust in Belize. Beyond that, he could not or would not say. His lawyers over the years offered explanations. The money was consumed by debts, the coins passed out of his control, and a claim that chronic fatigue syndrome had genuinely damaged his memory. The court's position was equally simple. You are the only person on earth who knows, and until you tell, you will sit in a cell. In December 2015, a judge held him in civil contempt. Not a criminal sentence, but confinement designed purely to compel an answer, at $1,000 a day in fines on top. Civil contempt is meant to be short. The law generally assumes 18 months breaks anybody. What followed instead became a legal legend. Month after month, hearing after hearing, year after year, Tommy Thompson sat in an Ohio jail, fines compounding past $3 million, holding a single sentence back from the world. The man had spent 13 years planning how to reach the most unreachable thing on the planet. Whatever else was true of him, he did not lack the capacity to wait. And so it ran, for nearly a decade, one of the longest civil contempt confinements in American history. The investors aged. Some died without seeing a dollar. The crew's lawsuits ground through the courts and won judgments. There was no visible money to pay. A court-appointed receiver even sent a new expedition back to the wreck in 2014, recovering more gold to satisfy creditors. The ship of gold, salvaged a second time, this time to pay for the legal wreckage of the first. And still, most of her cargo lies on the seabed today. The ocean, it turns out, retained majority ownership all along. Then, in February 2025, a federal judge finally wrote the sentence that ended it. The court was, quote, no longer persuaded that continued confinement will have a coercive effect. Translation: after 9 years and 3 months, the United States justice system formally conceded that it could not outwait Tommy Thompson. On March 4, 2025, he walked out of jail, 72 years old, $3.3 million in unpaid fines, and in sole possession, still, of the only map that matters, the one in his head. 425 souls kept the gold for 131 years. Thompson kept his 500 coins hidden for 25, 10 of them from inside a cell. The Atlantic gave up her secret to mathematics. The mathematician gave up nothing. So run the ledger, the way we always do. The sea took 15 tons of gold and 425 lives, and helped crack an economy, and today still holds most of what she took. The engineer took $12.7 million of honest Columbus money and turned it into the greatest discovery in treasure hunting history. And his investors' return, 30 years later, stands at zero. The courts took 9 years of a man's life in exchange for one sentence and never got it. There are no winners in this one. Only the story, and the 500 coins, sitting somewhere tonight, in the dark, exactly as patient as the ocean that made them famous. Here's the thing this whole series keeps teaching. Gold doesn't corrupt the ground it sits in. It corrupts the space between people, the promises, the paperwork, the trust. The welcome stranger got smashed on an anvil. Busang never existed. And the ship of gold gave up her treasure, only to watch it disappear again, this time into a lockbox no robot can reach. Next time, we go back to the desert, to a mine that men have died searching for over a century, a mountain range in Arizona, a lost claim, and the question of whether the most famous mine in America ever existed at all. Subscribe. The ground is patient, and so are we.